Yeah, welcome to everybody. It's a great pleasure to have Carsten Nicolai here for a conversation. My name is Nikolaus Hirsch, an architect and curator based in Frankfurt. I've been working with Carsten for a number of years, and hopefully we will find out some new aspects of his work during that conversation. Carsten Nicolai is born in Karl-Marx-Stadt in former East Germany, and he had, as most of you will know, had many solo shows all over the world. Just to name some recent of those shows, one was at Hangar Bicocca in Milan, or Musée d'Art Contemporain in Montreal, both 2012, or the MMK in Frankfurt, or Pace Gallery in New York, and YCM AM Yamaguchi, which was 2010, just to name some shows of this decade. Group exhibitions include many important shows like Soundings at the MoMA in New York, or Venice Biennale and Documenta, and many more. There's no time to mention all of that. Besides his work as an artist, he has under the name of Alvar Noto, a career as a musician or music performer, and he also is the founder of a very specific label of distribution called Raster Noton. But we will be talking more about that, and as a starting point for our discussion, we will take Carsten's spectacular new work, Alpha Pulse, that was premiered last night here in Hong Kong, and from there we will discuss and focus very much on notions of scale, because we think it's an interesting topic to discuss within Carsten's work, but I think it also relates in a broader way to artistic practice today. We hope to discuss these questions of scale also in relation to questions of distribution, and which to me makes sense also within this context of an art fair. Yeah, starting with the question of scale, Carsten, is Alpha Pulse, you have heard this question quite often, this is a very large work which has a very urban impact, so it's very visible within urban space. You synchronize somehow your performance also between yourself as an artist and the tallest building in Hong Kong. Is this the largest work so far, and what does scale means in that case?
Yeah, it's maybe in terms of dimension and reach into a city, it's probably the biggest work I ever done. And many journalists asked me basically that question, and every time I was very surprised, because I never thought so much about the scale, actually, when I was working on it, because when you plan such a project, you not work in the real situation. You imagine how the situation is. You maybe can build a model, maybe you have some plans. But basically, the working process for such a work is very similar to a smaller work, or a work that may have not such great visibility. So for me, in this way, the scale is not so important. There are smaller works who actually maybe even more complex in terms of preparation sometimes. But the real, let's say, the real dimension I really just realized maybe yesterday. And even then I couldn't really, because when I'm performing, I'm involved so much that I cannot really see it even. So I have to look at photographs or documentation to realize what is really happening. That's because I'm just too involved. Yeah.
Yeah, because for me, as part of the audience, it was of course very striking to see you performing, and in your back this immense building of more than 400 meters height. I think it really raised the question of scale between a performer and the urban scale. There was another dimension of the project which was a very digital dimension, an app. So I think there were very different elements that refer to each other. So there was, maybe you can say something about the question of synchronization. So is there something that, a moment where you synchronize different scales and dimensions in your work?
Yeah. I think for me, scale is a very, very important fact, because, I mean, as you know, I studied architecture, and in architecture, Le Corbusier basically made a modular, made a measure system. In Japan, we have a measure system, the tatami, for instance. So there is a kind of modular grid. And this kind of grid, what is related to us, to the human body, it's for me very important. Because I think that an artwork should have a human scale. It should be not too monumental. It should, and I think as well, if a work has this kind of human scale, then then it's as well is the option to be more humanistic with the work, and that's something what I really really like to achieve. And the question from the like Alpha Pulse, for instance, of course, you have this gigantic 400-meter high tower, but in opposition, you have an element what is just big as a telephone, and it's kind of, let's say, it's kind of macro situation, and this levels the scale as well, because this the small device, the big skyscraper, the additional screens we installed yesterday for the performance, they show different dimensions, but they show as well that every element can basically be part of it and have a kind of power as well. It's not only the tower, and that makes it, that levels it into the scale. Otherwise, probably if it's just the tower or only multiple towers, for instance, then you would produce something what would be monumental.
Did you actually had direct access into the telecommunication system of the building? So when we talk about synchronization, how literal is synchronization?
Yeah, this was one of the first ideas, of course, to go straight into the system of the tower and work direct, interactive with the tower. The system is not built for such a situation. So there was a long process how to synchronize everything, and in the end we synchronized on a very, very basic level. The iPhone app is just basically scanning the rhythm of the pulse. So the tower is a kind of, in music we have always music technology term, you say always master and slave. So the tower is the master, and everything else is basically synchronized to the visual pulse of the tower. So there is actually no direct digital like Wi-Fi or IP or whatever communication happening. It's really just based on a visual impact of the tower itself. What is actually much better as well, because it's the result what you see. You don't have any time delays, you don't have any cable problems or whatever. So it really goes straight in that what's happening. Yeah.
Well, what does the idea of pulse means for you, also in relation to the pulse of a city, of an urban landscape? Is there something that you could relate between the idea of pulse and alpha waves and the urban landscape or architecture as a background?
I mean, in German, pulse means for us it's the pulse of your blood pressure, of the heartbeat, in a way. So our body is defined by a pulse, but as well in terms of sound, you have a pulse. We have the light source as a pulse, and these three elements are basically can interact, yeah? or we kind of get stimulated by light or sound, and we can synchronize. And that's actually what's all the time happening, that our body in an environment is adjusting to the environment, is influenced by light sources, by sound. I mean, we all know the effect on sound, for instance, on the body. But of course, different light wavelength, the pulsing lights, it has an immense influence on our psychological behavior.
You once mentioned the example of Tokyo in the post-Fukushima time, where actually there was a totally different light experience.
Yeah, this was very interesting. When I visited Tokyo straight after Fukushima, they had this policy that basically they cut everything off what took power, what was not necessary. What is a great situation actually. So all advertisement being switched off, everything, some of the additional air condition, whatever. But when I was walking through Shibuya, and Shibuya is maybe the most colorful, vibrant place I know. The city looked completely different. The buildings looked completely different. The light on the street, it was very dark actually. I never saw Shibuya so dark. And then you're realizing actually that architecture today, or the impression of a city, is very much defined by light sources who are not primarily installed from architect or planners or basically advertisement or additional light sources from our backgrounds, commercial light sources, or have immense influence how you perceive the city. And that made me think as well, okay, a classical city like Florence was defined by architects, and it's still kind of in this way you can experience it. But if you go to modern cities, what we build now, and I'm sure China has many of them, they are very different, very different definition now, very in a very different way.
I think it's interesting how built environments actually define also or responds to and has an interaction with an audience. And I think in that respect also your work here in Hong Kong, of course, has a huge audience, potentially speaking, of urban dwellers, citizens of Hong Kong. At the same time, last night we saw a performance, so you have a very specific audience of art connoisseurs to the broadest extent, or music connoisseurs. How would you reflect on the question of audience, or who do you see perceiving your work?
In the first place, really, I think I ignore that question. What I do, I really have a Volko-egocentric work process. I just do what I think I would like to do, or what the other day I described it like this, basically that I create things what I'm missing myself, or there's a kind of creative energy inside us what drives you to do something. And it's not necessarily, in the first place, you think on the audience. I think it's something what comes later. I think that comes maybe more with the music when you, but even there, the process of composing or to make sound pieces is a total isolated process. It's a very private process, and then when you maybe would like to perform a piece, then you start thinking about how to make it public.
Yeah.
How should it, then that's the moment basically when you start a little bit, okay, how can I involve the audience?
I think in that sense, maybe it's less a question of audience than of distribution, which is to me a notion that is very important, quite striking in your work. Because I think if I look at your work and your practice, I think you cover a lot of different aspects of what we could call distribution. On the one hand, of course, something we can see here in the fair, artwork that can be collected, that is exhibited in galleries, in museums, and on the other hand, there is your practice as albanoto, as a musician, who produces records, who does performances, and then maybe as a third element, your role as a distributor of the label Rasta Noton. Maybe can you reflect on the question of distribution as something that triggers your work also?
Yeah, I mean, we all know that the art world is produces a lot of unique pieces, and it's very, for instance, very unusual that artist groups are not so normal, or that artists have pseudonyms, or that artists work together. It's not that common. Like, for instance, when you work with music, we have as musicians we have a great tradition of collaborations, actually, and sometimes collaborations of people who are not do the same thing or come from different backgrounds, and that's one aspect. So there are many different things, differences in this kind of field when you work with art or when you work with music. And in art, you produce a single art piece. In music, it's about multiplying and distribution much more. So you're actually not very interested that you only make one CD or so. You're probably more interested, okay, I would like that the CD goes out and reaches so much people as possible. It's a very different way of distribution or of reaching out. Yeah. Yeah.
I think they're looking at your work. The differences are clear. What happens today in a situation when many museums actually try to blur certain classic boundaries, when institutions like the MoMA in New York starts very ambitious performance programs, and the idea of actually collecting performances comes up. So the collection of time-based formats and experiences comes, I think, a new direction of museal practice. So what do you think about this hybridization of what you called two different formats?
I think like 10 years ago, I was thinking that maybe gonna move into a situation where the borders will blur more and more, and maybe one day there will be basically not much difference between this kind of art forms. But then I had a very brief and small conversation with Christian Markley, and he is somebody who works as well in the music and does visual art, and he just said, you have always to think about the context first and place things in the right context. You cannot expect that things will blur that much as you might try or want it. And actually that helped me. It helped me a lot because I think museums are not concert places, and concert places are not museums. And I think that it's there may be some spaces who can work in between, specifically like smaller spaces, like non-profits, little artist-run spaces, or with a certain flexibility. But if you go to a bigger scale, I think you really have to be careful what you place where. And it starts with very, very basic questions of acoustics. Yeah. We call it a white cube and a black cube. And they are really different. So.
Yeah, I remember we were collaborating on a concert at Porticus last year, which is a white cube to a certain extent, but also we had to be very basic in terms of the acoustic conditions of this format of a concert.
Yeah, well, remember that you did the exhibition architecture for the exhibition, this group exhibition Frequencies. Yeah. And one of the major question was, we have many sound pieces, how we isolate them in a room with where there's no division. So yeah, this is one aspect, of course. But the other aspect, of course, is time-based media, time-based work. I think a part of the reason I like, for instance, on using such time-based processes is that it's not collectible, that it's not, that you cannot freeze it, that it's not like repeatable. Yeah, the performance last night was only one time and will be never the same, let's say, or it's not reproducible in this way. The only thing what will be left will be some documentation material, and that's it. And but I think that's good like this, because we, in a time where values are always, let's say, materialized, I think it's good to have something immaterial too.
Yeah, I think it almost introduces a criticality to the material that basically also says not every material is the same, and that there are differences of what you can do with the material. Yeah. Some might be collectible, others might exist in the future just through documentation.
Right.
And but coming back to your work here in Hong Kong, seeing it last night, there was of course this incredible scale, and I also had this like many of the members of the audience had this feeling Carsten Nicolai is controlling part of Hong Kong. So this whole question of synchronization and control in the times of a discussion about NSA and the power of Google, etc. So what does it mean for an artist or for an artistic practice to temporarily play with the city? It's basically a question about megalomania, to provoke you a little bit.
Yeah, it's difficult to answer because I never saw it that way. Yeah. Yeah, for me it was just the option to use the light, like the tower as a light source. Yeah, and I never thought about controlling the city or. I think this is more like a Hollywood scenario. Yeah.
But it reminded to a certain extent also
I remember some scenes when, like Batman or something like that.
Well, it reminded me a bit of movies like Fritz Lang's Metropolis. Of course, also of Kraftwerk, a kind of man-machine topic, where there's an interesting interface here.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm German. I do electronic music, Kraftwerk.
And we have to repeat certain cliches here.
Yes, yeah.
So that's our job.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear. I mean, obvious. Yeah, technology and yeah, the combination with music, but as well, I think it's a long dream of mankind, or for some reason we try to rebuild ourselves. Yeah, we try to create artificial intelligence. More or less, we trying to create ourselves again as a machine. Right? That's a long dream. I mean, we can have a long philosophical discussion about that topic, but you never should forget we building the cities. It's not somebody else building the cities. That's our creation. It's part of us. So it's not really that the city is against us. I think it's part of us, and and we created that city. So. So I never see the city as an enemy. I see the city actually as something what gives us a place. Yeah.
I think in that sense it's quite intriguing to see an artist establishing that link or contextualizing and incorporating the city or an object that has been made by others or in the past. Last night you mentioned, I think, quite an amazing example of an artist, a musician, Jean-Michel Jarre, who played a concert at the pyramids in Egypt. Maybe you can say something about that. Probably didn't influence your work at all, but I think it's an interesting example of an artist working with a context.
Yeah, there was this. I mean, it was just a historical reference because the scale came up again with the tower and so on. And but there was a real moment when electronic music had an incredible pop status, like a very unusual moment for pop music being instrumental, played with from electronic musicians, and there was this gigantomanic idea of performing in the most amazing places in the world, like the pyramids and so on, and this I think is for me kind of so absurd. But I not wanted to compare it to the last night. I wanted just to provoke a little bit the situation, that just to give you
some food.
To scale it down, let's say.
To scale it down. Yeah, but in an interesting way, some people in the audience also scaled it up even more than the pyramids, because at one moment the moon appeared, so people were somehow speculating in a very utopian way what the limit of your work might be. So what's the next step? So is it possible for an artist to go beyond the earth and
it's
like scaling up? What's the next limit for Carsten Nicolai?
I not want to answer that, but I will tell you a little story because maybe you mentioned the moon. I was some years ago invited in Japan into a temple to join a performance. What basically the temple was the view into a garden, and behind the garden was the forest. And it was a musical performance, but there was no musician. But he didn't tell me. I was sitting there for 2 hours and listening basically the noise of the forest and the garden. I mean, it's not only me. And we all completely been blown away by the composition, completely. Like, was really incredible what you start hearing, noises, animals. You thought it's completely well organized. You projected something into the nature. And I think that's something what is very beautiful, that you basically take the nature as the scale, or as the value what you want to achieve.
I think after that statement on scale by Carsten, we would like to open up the panel to the audience for questions, yeah, please go ahead. Mention your name if you have a question, and we have mics here in the room. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much for the discussion, and I'm just want to bring back a question on the architecture itself. It's the International Finance Show Center, and I just wonder if you both of you have any special impressions of this center, perhaps as a monument of Hong Kong, as an icon of Hong Kong, and also about the value, because you mentioned you particularly like time-based artwork, because it's something not exactly collectible and so on. And I just wonder your idea of value in terms of artworks, your idea of value, artwork's value, or general idea about value. Thank you.
You want to answer the architecture first?
Well, I can't answer for Carsten. What I can say, of course, is that of course the building is an icon for Hong Kong, but in a very temporary way. I think there is also something very interesting about architecture, which has such a strong impact on Hong Kong. It's probably the most amazing incorporation of architecture and built environment on Earth, because it's so dense and so architectural. On the other hand, every building is very temporary. So for how long will that be the tallest building? For how long will it be an icon? So to a certain extent, you could argue, and I could give you many examples, that temporary artworks like Carsten's might actually become, through archives, etc., might become much more permanent in a way, in its perception, than that building. So there is, I think, a very interesting relationship between the duration of formats. You might call it a concert or a projection or light installation, or the physical architecture. So I think to play with these different durations and formats is something incredibly interesting and I think very productive.
I think duration maybe is a good keyword, because this can explain the second question as well. As I studied landscape architecture, I was basically trained to build complete new landscapes from the scratch. And what you realized is that basically you will never see in your lifetime, or it's not possible. Basically, you plan 200 years ahead already, something like that. And then you're realizing that many of the things we are doing actually has always the duration that we can experience it. There's and let's say garden designers from the 19th century or 18th century designed gardens who are being basically 100 years later exactly as they wanted to have them, the trees being in the right size. And then I saw it, and I think that's something what will make you really think about duration, time, and maybe this to lose basically the idea that maybe you always have to experience it to go have a further view. I think that's something what is I think it's I was very much influenced, maybe coming from that background, from that landscape design background.
Yeah, to a certain extent, you could argue that by looking at the notion of urban landscape, which is a well-known notion, it introduces the idea of nature into the built environment of cities that were always thought of anti-nature. But it's a classic topic of the 19th century in Western culture, that the notion of urban landscape introduced by French authors like Baudelaire and others, somehow the urban, the city became what was perceived as nature. And in that sense, it might be interesting to think of us as gardeners of that, yeah? Where you do small interventions, but the effects of that might be readable or perceivable many years later. Or you do very small ephemeral interventions. And I think that's maybe quite interesting that last night a gardener or someone who is a learned gardener made an intervention into Hong Kong. Are there other questions here?
Hello, I would like to ask about some notions between materiality and immateriality. Yeah, because as I see your basic material view, maybe sound and light, but how about motion? Because, for example, I just cite for one exhibition for an example, because it's an exhibition called Momentum in London, Barbican. It's created by UVA. So they are using motion and light installed in a, kind of a void. So making, creating a kind of unusual experience for the general public. So basically, because as I see it now, it's not about something that is, physical, but your work is about sensuality of the transmission, you know what I mean? So I'm thinking about, will you extend your idea, or how you see about motion in your
emotion or motion?
Work. Motion.
Motion.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, motion is. I mean, maybe motion is not a. It's not a. It's not a term what I put in the first place. Let's say, for me, motion is always already involved in everything. Yeah. So, but to make it a little bit more understandable, how I think is maybe when I work with sound, I really see sound as a material, as a physical material, even if it's invisible, even if it's immaterial. I even think that sound is architecture, because if you think about architecture, it can define space, it can create social spaces. It's architecture is main elements is 3 dimensions and time, and of course the social aspect. And I think the same 3 aspects you can cover with sound. And I really even think that we can, or that you could create architecture with sound. You can build physical walls, like walls you experience, you don't see, but you can experience them. And so even if it's not visible, I really think that I understanding this is a real material. Yeah. So, yeah.
I think we have time for one last question.
Yes, hello, Jörg Stark from the Stark Foundation in Berlin. First, thank you very much, for enriching the art world with your projects. I had the honor, together with my wife, to be there yesterday night, and it was really a big experience for us, and it was very, very nice. Yes, thank you very much. I also never had the idea that you controlled something there. For me, it was that you make something visible which is actually invisible. So the pulse of the town which is there was coming out for me, you know, in this project with light and sound. And this was a vision I had. There was never the feeling of control in this work. The control was coming after synchronizing my iPhone with the tower. And then something was coming up, some numbers, and I pressed them, but I don't know if something changed. So my question is, what is actually this app about? When you press these numbers, is there something changing or is there something happening? Yes?
Yeah, you couldn't hear it because it was too loud. There's a small sound in the speaker on the iPhone, and the numbers give you the option to change the sound. But in the performance, you don't hear it because was too loud, basically. Yeah.
So it's only you hear it from the iPhone itself.
Yes.
Because at the end I thought when many people are pressing the 2, then the sound 2 is coming a little bit more.
No. It's basically the iPhone app is not made really for the performance itself. It's more made that you maybe you see the tower from a quiet place and then you switch it on and then you have the sound. And then you have the option choosing different sounds.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And a compliment for your work, which you showed in Frankfurt also. It was amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I recommend to all of you to download the app now, of course, after that. And for those who haven't seen the work last night, it's visible tonight.
Tonight again, yeah.
And tomorrow as well. I think it's quite an experience. I can really highly recommend this, and I thank you very much for listening to us, and thank you, Carsten. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nikolaus.